Hi there. We're going to be looking at finding simple percentages. So this is the question we're aiming to be able to understand, and here's another question for you to have a go at and check your understanding. Before we go on to that, we're going to look at a few sort of general ideas about how to find percentage of amounts. If I begin with an amount, which I'm just going to choose is £360, and what we're going to do is we're going to find some percentages of 360. So that means that our 360 is our 100%. So that's where we're going to start from, and what we can do is with that as our centre point we can find some percentages of £360. To start off with, a nice easy percentage to find is always 50%. 50% is half of 100%, so that means that 50% of £360 is going to be half of it, and therefore we're going to need to divide 360 by 2, which means that that is £180. From that point we can find some other amounts. So from 50% I can find 5%, or I can find 25% quite easily. If we first of all look at 25%, that's half of 50%, so again we're going to have to divide by 2. So if I take £180 and divide it by 2, 25% of 360 is £90. Slightly more difficult than that, but still not too challenging, is to find 5%. Now we know that 50% is £180. 5% is a tenth of that, because the 5% would make 50%. So we're going to need to divide it by 10. If I take £180 and divide it by 10, the 0 will fall off the end for an unmathematical way of thinking about it, or the decimal place will move from to the right of the 0 to in between the 8 and the 0. What that means is we end up with £18 being 5%. Now another amount that's fairly easy to find from 100% is 10%. Now again, if we think about 10%, we'd need 10 of those to make up 100%, so this is 10 times smaller than 360. So we're going to need to divide by 10. If we divide 100% by 10, we get 10%, so we're going to need to divide 360 by 10, and we end up with £36. Now that allows us to find some other, what could be considered more complicated percentages quite easily. For example, if I combine together my 25% and my 10%, that will give me 35%. And if we just have a look at, that means that's £90 plus £36. So 35% of £360 is £126 by combining two easier percentages to make a more difficult one. And probably the easiest way to find any percentage is to start by finding 1%. Now 1% is found, it is 1/100th of 100%. It goes into 100% 100 times. We're going to need to divide it into 100 bits then to find out what 1% will be. If you take 360 and think about the fact that the decimal place is just after the 0 on the right hand side, if we divide it by 100, that means it's going to jump twice, so the decimal point ends up between the 3 and the 6. And that means that if we divide by 100, we end up finding out that 1% is £3.60, and from there we could multiply it by 17, and that would give us 17%. Or we could multiply it by 13.5, and that would give us 13.5%. So that's a little quick idea about how to find percentages of amounts. Let's try and apply it to our question here, finding 10% of 450. Well, first of all, let's remember that if 450 is our starting point, then 100% is 450. To find 10%, we're going to need to divide 150 by 10, and that's how we found the 10% before. and that gives us 45. Okay, at this point you may want to pause the video, go back and have a look at some of the explanations and check you understand, and then have a go at this question here, finding 15% of 940. And then in a moment you can start the video again from this point and see if you were right. So let's have a look at how you did. If we want to find 15%, that's made up of 10% and 5%. So let's find those two values. 10%, which is easier to find, of 940 is when we divide by 10. So dividing by 10, we end up with 94. 5% is half of that. So if we want to find 5%, we need to halve our 10%. Now 10% was 94, half of that is 47. And therefore, to find our 15%, we just need to add the 10% and the 5% together. Adding these two together, we get 141. I hope that helped you understand finding percentages of amounts, and therefore will allow you to progress your level even further. Thanks for your time. Bye bye.